Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. How many of you actually plan for retirement? Well, if you're like a lot of people, you're probably one of those who are sitting back waiting for Social Security to compensate you for a life that you worked diligently hard to have. Well, you're going to discover some interesting things today as we are joined by America's definite expert when it comes to the American monetary system, talking about how our Social Security is actually going to fall behind when it comes to the rate of inflation. We're going to discover how also increases in health care premiums will also be one of those things that we'll find that we just won't have enough money at the end of the rainbow. I'd like to join the Beyond 50 radio program today, our guest, Andrew Gause. Andrew, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, tell us what's going on here. I mean, you don't think about things like, cost of inflation raises and raising Medicare thing. It's kind of funny how we find ourselves in a set system that basically the government's pillaged in the first place.
Yeah, indeed. I wrote my second book was Uncle Sam Cooks the Books in 2003.
Go ahead.
And I think nowhere is it more apparent than the Social Security Trust Fund. So, way back in 1986, they warned us that by the time we reached 2010, the number of retirees would exceed the number of workers contributing to the system, and so therefore we were going to have this huge deficit. And the only way to combat it was TEFRA, the tax increase of 1986. It was the biggest increase of all time. Anyone who was working at that time may remember it. And our payroll taxes went up to 15%, 7.5% from the employer and 7.5% from the employee. And for all those years, there was money pouring into Social Security, so much so that you may recall Bill Clinton touting a zero deficit. I think in 94 or 95 came out with his bulletin board there, made a big zero on it, and everybody cheered. And then there was even talk of how to spend the surplus. What they didn't tell us was that every bit of the excess money was borrowed from the Social Security Trust Fund. So today, looking at the Social Security's trustee report, I see that we have $3 trillion in there, enough to last until 2034 at current rates. But when you drill down into the numbers, you see that it's borrowed. It's gone. It's not really there. That's the frightening part. Here's the analogy. If you want to use the same system to save your entire paycheck for retirement, now bear in mind, tongue is firmly in cheek, okay? Right. Get a shoebox and label it retirement savings. When you get your paycheck on Friday, cash it, put all the cash in the box. Now, of course, you're going to need money to pay the rent, and so take that out of the box and put in an IOU. You're going to need money to pay food. Take that out of the box and put in an IOU. That's the system that the government has used. And then at the end, the attempt now is to take the entire box of IOUs and somehow turn them into money. You can't pay it back. This is the problem. So using the government's budget, they have 74 cents of every tax dollar collected goes to debt service, meaning interest on the debt and paying back the Social Security Trust Fund. So that leaves them with just 26 cents to spend on defense. And that's about it. There's nothing left after that. So everything after that is deficit spending. And they turn to us now and say, well, there's a problem with the Social Security Trust Fund. Yeah, you stole all the money. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. And now we can't pay it back.
And to consider the fact that back in the 1970s when Nixon took us off the gold standard, we started getting out of the habits that our, parents and their parents before them were actually have when it came to actually saving money. Tell us about the differences about that, because our money just doesn't have any backing anymore.
Well, you're absolutely right, and that really is the common thing we baby boomers have, that what we were taught as children was, you remember the big three rules. I think it was save your money, pay your debts off early, and live debt-free. And the reasons that those were taught to us is because of that gold-backed dollar. So that when you saved your money each year, it was worth a little bit more. And plus, since money was so limited in quantity, you actually got a return when you deposited it in the bank, as opposed to the way it is now where they charge you to keep it there. That system worked fine when we were on the gold standard, but now we're not. And believe it or not, under the current system, those are the three worst things that you can do with your money. If you save it, it's worth less year after year. If you live debt-free, well, you're not taking advantage of using borrowed money to buy improving assets. And if you pay your debts off early, you're paying them off with dollars that are worth more than the ones you might pay with tomorrow or next year or 10 years from now. So the real formula is to spend your money as fast as you can, accumulate real, tangible assets that benefit from the inflation that is undoubtedly going to be unleashed on us over the coming decade. Because there is no way the federal government will say to us, hey, you guys, sorry, there is no Social Security for you. It is a sad situation, as I talk to seniors who are living on Social Security and find that the cost of living adjustments just don't keep up with the cost of living. But if I flash them back to those 70s and say, okay, here we are in 1973, and I'm saying to you that when you retire, 35 years from now, I'm going to give you, hold on to your hats, $1,000 a month.
Ooh.
Now, to the seniors, to the workers of that day, that must have seemed like a fortune. I think rent was $125, and you could feed your whole family for $50 a week, and a new car was $3,500, and a house was $35,000. So that is the real problem with our system, is that we cannot count on the future value of the dollars we save. So therefore, if we don't invest them, we have no chance of keeping up with inflation.
Now, because you're really on top of this, for our listeners, I want you to go ahead, if you could. Please describe why the Social Security system was originally created.
Well, remember where we were. 1934, we just came off of the Great Depression. We still call it that today. And the food lines in those days were visible, meaning you didn't just get a little card in the mail. I know there are 55 million Americans today on some sort of public assistance, but the food stamp numbers are huge, a great majority of that total. So instead of standing in a soup line or a bread line, these folks were given cards or stamps that they could redeem at the store to feed themselves. Absent that program, you would see the same long bread lines, if you've seen pictures of hungry people waiting for free food at soup kitchens and things like that, and there was no safety net. That was it. And so the idea was, okay, we'll make everyone save a portion of their money, earnings, and we'll put that money aside. The federal government will do it because Lord knows you can't trust the banks. And we'll hold it in trust for the people. And that's what they did. And in the beginning, when there were 4 people working for every 1 person retired, well, it made perfect sense. But now, when there's 1 person working for every person retired, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So what has happened to the Social Security system is that it's grown top-heavy, and the surplus that was built into it over the years has been borrowed and spent on other purposes so that politicians didn't have to raise your taxes. Had they had to raise your taxes to pay for all this wonderful social programming that they've done, then you would have revolted and thrown them out of office in the following year. So it is unfortunate and dishonest, and I believe every politician sitting in his seat in Washington right now, every congressman, every senator, and the president should all be terminated, and new people should come in. They've abused our trust.
It's such an interesting thing because earlier this year we were talking about this very subject, and there was a particular book I was reading. I don't remember the title off the top of my head, but it was interesting how in there seems to be people who, these are elected officials in our government, that feel that we are not entitled to Social Security benefits. We put this money in, and, in the end, we believe that, we contributed, we should be getting that back for the reason that we put it in there for, even though we didn't do it voluntarily. It was actually just done for us, which forced. For the most, when you think about the reasons behind it, it made sense back in the day when those reasons, came available. But I thought it was funny that here, potentially, the new House Speaker, Paul Ryan, out of Wisconsin, literally was quoted as saying,
he's a champion.
Americans are not entitled to Social Security. And I remember as I was talking with a guest, you know what would be interesting is to stand in front of Paul Ryan and say, have you saved any money at all on your own? Because you're not entitled to that.
Well, he doesn't have to, right? He has his own pension plan.
Oh, of course he does. But the point is, we're going to go ahead and take that money away from you because you're not entitled to it.
Yeah, a different way to look at it would be if your insurance company, because this is what, I've had long debates with Social Security Administration officials. Curiously, the head of Social Security, when I wrote Uncle Sam Cooks the Books, shared the same last name as me, Goss. It was odd as hell because that's not a common name. And so in these discussions, they point out that this is not a trust fund, even when reading the report. And I pointed this out in Uncle Sam Cooks the Books. They said the trust word does not mean the same thing when we use it as when you use it. So if you think the word trust means what you think it means, it doesn't. It means what we think it means. And this trust fund does not belong to the people. You have to think of it more as insurance. So if you've had your auto insurance for the last 25 years and you've paid your premium annually, and now you're at the end of 25 years and your insurance company says to you, okay, we don't want to sell you insurance anymore, what would the government do? How would they react? What would they think of that? They'd probably pass some sort of law saying you have an obligation to sell the insurance. Well, that's how they want to look at it. That all the money that we've paid in have represented premiums for insurance, and that now that might change. And it's only for 2 years. Only as long as the current Congress is sitting can they obligate anyone to pay this Social Security. So in reality, what they are saying is correct. And once they get us to understand that, then you might see a little movement in this area. But Paul Ryan is one in particular who believes that benefits should be cut and that means testing is the order of the day. And I've heard Chris Christie use it. Mr. Christie, in fact, said, the money's gone. Get over it. I'm not going to get over it because if you fooled me here, where else are you fooling me?
Right.
In reality, having a 401k or a IRA puts yourself in a rather unfortunate condition of them pointing to that and say, well, you have saved this money, and we're going to allow you to withdraw it at the same rate as a Social Security recipient, but we're not going to give you Social Security because you've saved this money. So this idea of means testing for Social Security should be resisted as vociferously as possible, and the position of the baby boomers should be that there should be no change in Social Security for those who need it, for those who don't. The government should be forced to take that money from general revenues and put it back into the trust fund. And if that means that they have to not spend $75 million this year figuring out if mice behave differently when they're on LSD, and if it means that we can't spend $750 million bringing in refugees from other countries, well, so be it. That's what it is. We slash all of that spending and we pay back the Social Security Trust Fund. And once that's done, then if you want to do all that sort of thing, then go right ahead. But I think their feet should be held to the fire, and we should not listen to how it's the citizens that are burdening Social Security, because, again, for 30 years we've put a surplus balance in that Social Security Trust Fund, and it's the politicians who misappropriated that money. That's what they did, and now they should be held to account for it.
You know, I really like that term, misappropriated. Oops, we don't know where it went. But I can tell you one thing for sure, is that I know, as a fact, from people specifically, we're talking people in their 20s, that tend to be, or even 30s, that tend to be deemed unable to work normally as people in society. So what do? They apply for Social Security benefits, and in some cases, we're talking $2,000 or $3,000 a month.
Oh, yes. No, I've seen it myself. That's the OASDI.
Now, let's talk about this. What the hell's going on there?
Well, that segment of Social Security is already broke. There's no surplus. It hasn't borrowed. Money hasn't been borrowed. It's empty. And that's already in deficit. So this new trend when disability insurance was first included in the Social Security Trust Fund, you could easily spot a disabled person. Mm-hmm. Now, you can't. You're right. I met a 31-year-old who was in his shorts and his T-shirt and long beard and hadn't combed his hair for a week, but he was disabled. What was he doing? He was riding his skateboard. Why? Because some doctor told him that, his work put too much pressure on him and it was causing him stress that was affecting his heart. Okay, sign this form, pay me my doctor's fee, next thing you know, you're collecting disability. So the disability insurance program is under heavy, heavy, heavy abuse. And I think that's one area right there. If we just, took some of the IRS guys and sent them out investigating some of these disability cases, we'd find in many cases these are fully able-bodied people. And again, a disabled person is easy to spot. You don't need too much investigative time.
Sure.
But I would contend that this person was simply unwilling to work and did not belong on disability insurance. Even though he was an acquaintance, it was easy enough to see that he did not need disability insurance. And others, obviously, disabled, do. And I don't think they should be excluded. But certainly those that are capable of working should not be allowed to collect disability.
Now, here we look overseas, for instance, at the condition that Greece has been in. Now, that can certainly happen, and certainly we're worried, and we hear in the news, that might be something we need to be concerned about here. Yeah, think about that.
At any moment.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, please.
Well, if you look at the circumstance in Greece, so they gave up their monetary authority when they joined the Euro system. So prior to that, Greece could issue, and every other country in the Eurozone, when they ran a deficit, they could simply write a bond, hand the bond to their central bank. The central bank would create the drachmas and then loan it to the government. This so-called deficit spending could go on ad infinitum because no individual investor had to say, here's the drachma, give me the bond. If they didn't do that, the Bank of Greece simply created the drachma and loaned it to the government. That's what our government does. So the Federal Reserve is a privately owned consortium of banks that operates the monetary policy of the United States. They are not part of government, folks. They are privately owned entities. And if I list the owners, you'll know them right off the bat, right? J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Wells Fargo. These are the primary owners of the Federal Reserve banks. Now, each time government spends more than it takes in, it can go to the marketplace and say, hey, you guys with dollars, we need $1 billion more than we took in taxes. Here's our IOU, a bond. Give us $1 billion. But as many people have pointed out and speculated, what if no one wants to buy the bond? Why then the Federal Reserve simply creates the money and loans it to the Congress. Well, Greece ran out of that option. So once they joined the euro, they no longer had the option to print the money if no one else wanted it. And so they ran against their wall, where investors finally said, nah, we don't think so. We're not going to buy your bonds. That left Greece unable to finance its deficits, and that's when the problem started. Now, we in the United States are faced with the luxury of having a dollar that's the worldwide currency reserve unit. And so everyone in the world saves them, and everyone in the world loans us money. We export our inflation. To the extent that they don't, the central bank simply creates the dollars and puts them in the system. But the supply of these dollars has exploded in the last 7 years. So in order to keep our system from falling into the Grecian nightmare, we created more money. If you looked at the Fed's balance sheet in 2007, how much money they had issued, there was $1 trillion on their balance sheet, and in their vault were $1 trillion worth of bonds. Today, their balance sheet is $4 trillion. $1.5 trillion is in bonds, but the rest of it are in these mortgage-backed securities that are essentially worthless. So what's backing our currency? these mortgage-backed securities. And quite frankly, our financing needs are nowhere near done. So the rest of the world is starting to look with an eye, hey, what's the dollar really all about? Now, in this time of unrest, if you're a Frenchman or if you're an Italian or if you live in the Middle East and you have money in the bank, you called somebody and said, you know what, convert my money into dollars and move it to New York, because at least then I know it's safe. And so we've enjoyed for the last 3 years a flood of money coming into the system, but once situation settles itself out on the world stage, just as quickly that money will reverse trail and head back to where it came from. And that's the time, I fear, when the U.S. dollar is going to be under such pressure that the value will be cut in half as a result of additional printing by the Federal Reserve. So we're on the path right now. We're at the point where they talk about takeoff because the Federal Reserve, in an attempt to stem this flow, is going to start raising interest rates, making it more expensive to borrow money. And in doing so, I'm afraid they're going to unleash a tidal wave of inflation that will wipe out the purchasing power of a typical baby boomer. And you'll find yourself, just when you need it most, having dollars that are worth substantially less than they were when you put them away. It'll look the same on your statement, but it won't have the same potency or purchasing power.
You know, you think about all this, and you realize that there are a lot of people that are diligently really trying to plan for their retirement. And then it comes to a point where you have cost of living and inflation just eating that away to a time where they realize they're really outliving their money. What can we do about this? I mean, especially if Social Security isn't going to be there for that security net, for the reason it was initially instilled, it was because it was believed that a lot of Americans just simply wouldn't do something like that. They wouldn't save. They wouldn't create that security net for themselves. What do we do about this?
Okay, so I'm going to channel my wife now, all right?
Okay.
So she's my age. She was born in 57. I was born around the same time. And she's going to whack me in the back of the head and say, read the damn instructions. Okay, so I will. So I'll pull out the Constitution. And I see Article 1 of the Constitution. No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debt. Now, to the founders, it was very clear. If you ever allow banks to control the issue of your currency, well, they're going to operate in their best interests. So Thomas Jefferson said he thought banks, central banks specifically, was more dangerous to our liberty than standing armies. And I agree with him. Because in the period from 1792 to 1913, when the Federal Reserve Act was inspired, there was virtually no inflation. If you saved $1 in 1815 and went back to it in 1915, it had about the same purchasing power, plus or minus a few percent. But once the Federal Reserve took control of the money in 1913, between the period of 13 and 29, they caused the corporate bankruptcy of the United States. I mean, we were in such dire condition that by 33, Franklin Roosevelt recalled all of the citizens' gold and replaced them with more Federal Reserve notes, and then said to Americans, you can't own gold anymore, because frankly, it's the only thing that will protect you against inflation. So for those next 60 years, we operated on a pseudo-standard, and then in 71, they officially delinked. At that time, gold was 35 paper dollars to the ounce. Today, it's nearly $1,100 to the paper ounce. And that's the problem. So if we don't address that problem as individuals, or as a nation, I should say, I remember what my grandfather said. He said, if the government is foolish enough to relinquish its gold, then it's every citizen's duty to seize it. And he was one of those hard money guys. He saved his money in silver dollars, and $20 gold pieces, and $10 gold pieces. He refused to put it in the bank. He, never trusted banks ever since, of course, he was alive, and he saw it firsthand. Many of us have never seen a bank closure or bank run or being restricted in your access to your money. And now more than ever, and I'm going to say this figure, I'll back it up with any numbers you guys want to fact check on, 96% of every dollar in circulation is merely a blip on a computer screen. Less than 5% of what we call money is actually printed or coined money. So you don't have any money, folks. If you don't have silver dollars, $20 gold pieces, silver half dollars, you don't have any money. What you have are representations of money, or IOUs, in this big system. And if you remember your grade school fractions, so when Ronald Reagan took office, there was $1 trillion in circulation. So if you had a dollar, you had 1 over 1 trillion. Now today, 30 years later, plus 40 years later, goodness, I can't believe it's flying like this, but here we are. There's $14 trillion in circulation, so you have 1 over 14 trillion. And if you remember your math teacher, that number is much, much smaller, even though the number on the top is still the same, even though your paper dollar still looks the same, even though your bank statement says the same. In terms of a fraction, your dollar is 1/14th, what is it? What's the math there? 1/20th of what it was just 40 years ago. And moving forward 40 years, goodness, if you're planning on leaving money to the next generation, I can only hear them laughing when we tell the stories. Well, when I was a kid, my first job, I got $1.25 an hour. Yeah, a lot of baby boomers share that same experience, but if you recall, it was 5 silver quarters. Those 5 silver quarters, if you would have just put them away, those silver quarters today are worth $4 a piece. So $1.25 an hour, 5 silver quarters times $4, $20 an hour. So if you're not making $20 an hour today, you're not making the equivalent of $1.25 in 1965. So I would urge you to consider more than the quantity of your money, the quality of your money. And in fact, to that end, I have 3 audio CDs that are very popular, and I'm going to give them to Beyond 50 listeners free of charge. If they'll go to your website, I'm sure you'll put a link up there. It is the definition of money, so that you can understand what the heck a dollar is. That's 1 half-hour audio CD. The second one is the Federal Reserve, and that's all it deals with, how the Fed works, where it came from, how it got into existence, and what its powers are. Mm-hmm. And then the third one, Protecting Your Wealth, that tells you how to go about acquiring mint-issued money, real money, which is separate and distinct from Federal Reserve money. So the U.S. Treasury, through the United States Mint, issues the only thing that is lawful money according to the Constitution. And if you don't have some of that, you're probably overlooking a big, big area of finance. Mm-hmm. And to get these, you can either go to the website, Beyond 50, not sure what that exact is, or call our 800 number, 800-468-2646, and just mention Beyond 50, and we'll send you this $25 value, free of charge, no charge, and you make your own determination. If after listening to these 3 CDs, half-hour apiece, about an hour and a half of your time, you don't have a basic understanding of what money is, then I've failed to do my job, and I'll certainly try again. 800-468-2646.
Andrew, thank you so much for sharing that valuable information with our listeners out there. I think it's time, I can't help but I was thinking about the whole time as we were talking here, about the movie Dumb and Dumber.
Yeah, it's an American classic, isn't it?
Now, I just wanted to pause for a moment so people could hone in on that. Now, I love that scene where the briefcase accidentally opens when they're fighting in the snow and they see all the money in it. And they realize, oh, my goodness, we've got all this money. Well, hey, we'll go ahead and we'll use it. We'll give them IOUs. We're good for it. And that's what our government's become.
That's right. There you go. Exactly right. And they've diluted your money. Unfortunately, if you're the OE, you're not going to be happy with a bunch of IOUs. You certainly can't spend them. And that really does nutshell. That's the entire monetary system in a nutshell. So I've likened it to a game of musical chairs. And as long as the music's playing, it doesn't matter that there aren't enough chairs to go around. But boy, when the music stops and you're trying to get your money out of a banking system that's locked solid, because, again, only 4% is in printed coin or cash, the other 96% are these IOUs, my goodness, there's just not enough to go around, and you should already have yours. That's my point. And so if you take 10 to 15% of your total assets and put it into what the Constitution says is money in your own control, then you can pretty much rest easy at night knowing no matter what happens with the rest of your stuff, that part will always be safe.
I want to thank you for taking the time to join us here on the program today. You know, it's just good to get people aware of, okay, it's time to make different decisions than the ones I've been making and not being passive. And if you can, for our listeners, give out that website one more time.
Sure. You can go to my website and, have at it. There's tons of writing up there, Andy, ANDYGAUSE.com, AndyGoss.com, or hit me up on Facebook if you're a Facebook person, or call, this is the main one, 800-468-2646. Their operators standing by. They'll take your order, your address, send you out these 3 audio CDs along with some background information. And listen, I buy and sell gold and silver coins, but you don't have to if you don't want to. If you want to just learn, that's fine with me. Get the audio CDs and make your own decision, because I think with that information you'll be empowered. 800-468-2646. Just mention Beyond 50, so it will be free of charge to you.
Absolutely. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can discover more also by visiting us at beyond50radio.com, the number 50. You can also subscribe to our free weekly e-news updates as well. Also join us on Twitter at Beyond50Radio as well as Facebook. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.